getting to embryology until the end of this unit when we do fertilization and implantation. But starting today and from this point on, I will be covering very briefly the embryology of each system. And so I want to start that off with reproductive. Let me get ours. And we have two new students joining today, Ginny and Rosette. Ginny?
Rosette.
Rosette. Ginny here. They were trying to get into Justin Moore's class, and he starts off with the endocrine system. He covers more of it at the beginning rather than along the way. So bear with them if they ask questions on how things are going and what's going on and stuff. But they have been in class, just not in our class. So welcome. So on the lecture notes on the male reproductive system, we are starting on page, we have it already, 45. All right. And today's the first assignment is due, and Thursday we have our first lab quiz. All right. So that will be usually, well, it varies. If we've covered the lab material already, it's at the beginning of the lab activity. If I want to give you some more time on that particular lab quiz, we may have it towards the end of the lab. All right, so it just kind of depends on if we need more time. Probably like having it at the end of lab, we'll be at the beginning of lab on Thursday, or a little bit towards the beginning. If I wait till the end of lab on Thursday, which is supposed to cover both male and female, nobody's going to look at female. Everybody's going to study just male because that's going to be on the quiz. All right, so its time will vary. If I do have it at the end, our lab is over at 5. I usually give it kind of when you guys are ready, so anywhere between 4:15 and 4:20 or so. Okay. Yes.
So for this Thursday one, it looks like it's
It'll
going to
be at the beginning. Yeah, because we'll cover everything today.
Okay, great.
There are open lab on Wednesday, so if you feel you need more time, open lab is Wednesday from 2:30 to 5:30. It's not in this room, it's over in the portable. But Jeff is really good about making sure that you have the models and slides and stuff that you need to look at, okay? So it's nice to have that between our two class periods that you can look at it. All right, I neglected to get additional batteries in classes for the pointer, so. Now remember on these first few slides actually come from a presentation I put together last semester when I was teaching reproductive physiology at Sac State. Okay, so these first few slides from that lecture content are a little bit more in detail than I required you to know, but they're also a little bit more demonstrative and a little clearer to follow. So just sit back and listen, and then I'll switch to our course's PowerPoint slides. So these are not on D2L, and relate the two materials. So we'll be looking at this at the end of the unit, but remember last week when we described the development of the pituitary gland, and I drew the embryonic disc, and I described the fact that we have the ectoderm forming the neurotube, and then we have the mesoderm forming smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, and we have the endoderm. Okay, we talked about the formation of the pituitary gland. So that's what you're looking at right here. That's the embryonic disc. Okay, again, I'm just kind of explaining where structures are. We'll actually look at how this forms at the end of this unit, but I need to talk about it a little bit early. And that's the embryonic disc that you see right here. So the neurotube is progressing in that formation. This structure right here is the amnion. We don't need to know it for now, but if you're wondering what that is, it's how the amniotic sac develops. We're looking at this structure right here, which eventually will fold and fuse to create the gut and the body too. All right? So here's the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and that endoderm, and here it's forming that groove. Okay? Starting to form the groove, and the groove is getting longer right here. And that's going to eventually form the neural tube, which is central canal and brain ventricles. Just to kind of bring you along the classification. So now this structure in aqua green is that embryonic disc. Kind of looking at it three-dimensionally. Here's the neural groove right here, running along the length. This is the expansion at the head for the brain. Here's the mesoderm, and here's the endoderm. Okay? Now in this cross section, it's folded already and formed the tube. This is the gut right here. This is what's going to be the stomach in the embryo. Okay? This is the umbilical cord going out towards the placenta. And this is the posterior abdominal wall and thoracic wall. We really don't have a diaphragm yet. So what we're looking at, as we look at this embryo, is, see how it's folded longitudinally? And here is the endoderm, and here is the ectoderm, and the cells that are going to become either sperm cells or egg cells migrate from the yolk sac and migrate back up here into that posterior abdominal wall. And that's where our primitive kidneys are going to form as they induce the development of those cells. So if you look on page 45 of your lecture notes, down about halfway down, it talks about the gonadal ridge. All right, notice the definition. That's a mass of mesoderm just medial to the mesonephros. All right, so here is the gonadal ridge. It's a column of cells, a column of mesoderm, two of them actually, one on either side of the midline. And this would be the developing aorta. This is like your back of your abdominal wall. And this thickening of endoderm here is going to form the tissue of either the testes or the ovaries. All right? So that's what we mean by the gonadal ridge. It's associated with this developing kidney. So I'm going to leave that image on the board for just a moment, and we'll go over the kidney development as well. But for some, especially for males, we talk about a genital urinary system. That's most applicable because the sperm passes through the urethra, and the urine passes through the urethra, all right? But for both male and female, the development of the kidney and the development of the gonads are very closely related. So in the developing embryo, there are a series of 3 kidneys that develop. The first one is called the pronephros. It has no function as a kidney. It doesn't filter the urine. Its purpose is to induce development. In other words, these cells release chemicals that cause the development of the gonads. All right? A similar thing occurs in the brain. Remember that outpouching of the hypothalamus to form the infundibular stalk? And just anterior to it, we had the outpouching of the optic nerve. As that optic nerve, you don't have to draw this, I'm just illustrating, as that optic nerve grows towards where the eye is going to be on the face, it induces the skin, essentially, to invaginate rather, and form a sac like that, and this becomes the lens. The chemicals released from these nerve cells induce these cells to become the lens. That's what we mean by induction, okay? So that's what's occurring here. The pronephros is inducing these cells to become the supportive structures of the testes or the ovaries. The next kidney is known as the mesonephros. Nephros for kidney. The reason this is important is because the duct that's associated with the mesonephros, called the mesonephric mesonephric duct, in the male will become the tube that the sperm travel through to get from the testes to the urethra. All right? So we haven't talked about these structures yet. I'm going to write them up so you have them in the area close together. It becomes the efferent ductules, the epididymis, the vas deferens, and about a ½ an inch of the urethra. Okay? So this disappears, this disappears. The blue structure remains as those duct systems. This is the true kidney known as the metanephros. And it actually functions as a kidney. And I have a little movie to show you of this happening as well. That's a ureter. Okay? So the gonad our testis develops here. So this is the relationship of this area right here that I want to show you. So this structure that you see right here, see how blood vessels coming out of what's developing as the aorta and associating with this mesonephros? It's actually filtering and forming a little bit of urine. Okay? This tubule of the mesonephros is going to disappear, but not before part of it remains as the mesonephric duct. You don't have to identify this diagram. This is outside of the scope of this course. I'm just using these pictures to clarify what's happening. All right, so here is that genital ridge again. Here are those incoming primordial undeveloped sperm cells migrating in to start multiplying and become part of the testes. Here is that mesonephros kidney. And notice what I want you to focus on is what's happening to these cells and what's happening to this tube of the kidney. These cells multiply and they become associated with cords of this tissue. Again, this is going to become the septum of the testes. That continues to occur as the testes is enlarging. Notice, here's our mesonephric tube, that blue line that I drew, starting to form a closer association with those cords within the testes. And we actually now have a connection of these tubes to that mesonephric tube. The sperm are always contained within a tubular structure. They're never free to move around within the male pelvic or abdominal cavity like the egg is. The egg can actually get fertilized up under the, near the stomach somewhere. Because once it's ovulated, it doesn't have to go into the oviduct. All right, it can go anywhere it gets pushed in the abdominal cavity. The sperm always stay within a tubule structure. And they go from the seminiferous tubules, so the epididymis, the vas deferens, the urethra, are always contained. And so we see this formation of these early tubes, and here's that paramesonephric duct. And they finally make a connection. All right? This structure, the paramesonephric duct in the female, disappears. So we see these kind of parallel, that actually now starts to look like a testis. Okay? There's those structures that you see here, and what you see in yellow come from that mesonephric duct. So now let's look at your lecture notes. And so this diagram up here, is this little small picture, is kind of what I drew down here, but doesn't show the pronephros. So this kind of brownish, you have this in your lecture notes, this kind of brownish structure right here is the mesonephros, the intermediate kidney. The yellow, on here, the yellowish brown duct with the lines would be the blue line that I have there. That's the mesonephric duct. Outside of that is the paramesonephric duct that we'll talk about on Thursday. That's what forms female structures. Okay, so in the early embryo, we have both. If it has male XY genes with the SRY chromosome, with the SRY gene, and it makes testosterone, that mesonephric duct disappears, the paramesonephric duct remains. All right? So if there are problems, the androgen insensitivity that we have is one of the case studies, there's problems, then this duct, the structures, we still have testes, but the external structures look like a female. The internal structures may or may not. So in the male, the mesonephric duct remains and is directly associated with the testes. In the female, the mesonephric duct disappears, and the oviduct, the paramesonephric duct, is separate. The eggs are not contained within a structure. Right? And the paramesonephric duct fuses to form the uterus as part of the vagina. The mesonephric duct forms the epididymis and the vas deferens and just part of the urethra. Right? So let me pull up that video. The YouTube video, if you want to watch it later, it's called Urogenital Development. Unfortunately, the subtitles are in French, but you can recognize the words. They're Latin-based. There's one for male and one for female. Clay animation. We'll go through it several times. Embryo is just kind of difficult to follow without animation. So what you're seeing here is the pronephros, which is going to disappear. And we're starting to see the appearance of the filtration material of the mesonephros, and the green structure is the mesonephric duct. I mean the mesonephric duct that's going to form our vas deferens. Here's the mesonephros now completely closed around that, and the mesonephric duct. And then you'll see the development of the gonad in just a moment. Here's the true kidney showing, the metanephros. And here's the gonad forming along that medial aspect of the mesonephros. Okay, the blue we're not going to pay attention to because that's the female structure. It's going to disappear in a moment. And now our mesonephros is going to disappear, and we'll see just the remaining structures of the mesonephric duct. Here's our true kidney developing. Here's our gonad moving down the abdominal wall. Mesonephros is disappearing, but we retain these connections here with the mesonephric duct. And this will become the paramesonephros is disappearing. This becomes the vas deferens and becomes associated with the urethra. Okay? So let me show that again. And just, even though we will talk about female on Thursday, I'll show it to you just for the comparison. Remember, you can see the three developing sets of kidneys on here. Pronephros, which induces the formation of the mesonephros, the gonad. These structures here will become the efferent ductules eventually. So the mesonephros and the mesonephric duct, and the gonads will develop right here. True kidney or metanephros is developing closer to the bladder. It moves up as the gonads move down. Okay? Here's our gonad, our testis in this case. The paramesonephros tubule here appears and disappears in the male. Paramesonephric duct disappears. All right, so just for comparison's sake, and we'll look at this again on Thursday. Let's look at the female one. Since it'll take a little longer to download. Okay, so it looks very similar. We're going to see instead of, here's the mesonephros, developing here as the pronephros disappears. And this will disappear too in the female. Okay, it doesn't remain. Mesonephros around it. And now is the, well, we'll see the true metanephros appear. The gonad will appear, but now it's going to be the developing ovary. Up here. And this structure right here is going to form the oviduct, the uterus, and the top part of the vagina as all of this disappears. Notice there's no direct connection between the gonads and the oviduct. So the oviducts come into the uterus, and behind the bladder we would have the rest of the uterus and the vagina. Okay, so we have those two different components, and we'll review that part for the female on Thursday. All right, so let's go back to your lecture notes. And look at a sagittal section of the fully developed male. We're looking at the development of the testes here. Now, where did we see them developing in the embryo? Where did we see them developing in the embryo? They weren't down here in the scrotum. They were way up high here along the posterior abdominal wall. So during fetal development, and this is complete usually by the end of the 7th month, the testes will have migrated behind the membrane lining the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum, will have migrated down the posterior abdominal wall into the pelvis, out a small channel, the inguinal canal, from the pelvic wall and into the scrotal sac. All right. Here is the epididymis that we said developed from the nasonephric duct or tubule, the vas deferens, carrying it into the urethra. So it's self-contained. Yes?
We don't have the slide on our...
You don't have this in the lecture notes, but it's on a PowerPoint slide. All right, so here's a diagram that you have in your lecture notes showing the formation of the male structures. And then this diagram shows the movement of the testes down the posterior aspect of the abdominal wall. There is a band of connective tissue. As this gonad is developing, there's a band that suspends it up here, and another band of connective tissue that follows it down here, down into the scrotal wall. These two bands are identified as the gubernaculum, specifically gubernaculum testes. The upper band in the male disappears. The lower band remains. And as it shortens, it actually pulls the testes down the posterior abdominal wall and into the scrotum. Now on Thursday, when we look at female development, both of those connective tissue bands remain. The upper band attaches the ovaries to the uterus. The lower band, as in the male, see how that lower band passes through the inguinal canal into the scrotum? The lower band forms a ligament that keeps the uterus tilted forward. So we see homologous structures in both of these components. By the 7th month, normally the testes have descended, have been pulled by the shortening gubernaculum down into the scrotum. And when a male baby is born, infant is born, the pediatrician will palpate the scrotum to make sure that both of the testes have descended. If not, they will keep checking that, because if the testes have not descended by puberty, the male will be sterile. The higher temperature in the pelvis or abdominal core does not allow the sperm to develop properly as they undergo mitosis and meiosis, and that will have to be done surgically. Okay? So that's the reason why the testes are located outside the body core cavity proper. And that's the role of the gubernaculum to do so, is to pull it down. Well, as it's pulling it down, it's also pulling down the tubes associated with the testes. So that's why we find the vas deferens passing through this same channel, the testicular artery and vein passing through that same channel, and nerves that innervate those structures, because they all get pulled down into the scrotum. And to do so, they have to pass through an opening or a weakness in the abdominal wall. Okay? So this bundle of structures is known as the spermatic cord. The content, the spermatic cord, has wrappings around that support it, and all of those wrappings are these layers of structures that got pulled down with the testes into the scrotum. All right? So, content-wise, obviously, we're going to have the tube structure. And then wall-wise, if you look on page 50 of your lecture notes, we'll move ahead to this slide. This is a diagram from Netter's Atlas. We have Netter's Atlas. It's in there. If not, you can look at this while you're diagramming. Okay? So this is that tunnel right here. Follow my hand. This is the tunnel that the testis followed as it was pulled down into the scrotum. We'll talk about the content in just a moment, but the walls of that structure were formed by the layers, successive layers, almost like sequences of arches. Some of you may have played with wooden blocks, or may still. And there, you can buy wooden blocks that have architectural elements. They have cones and arches and different things. So if you look at these as a series of arches, if this was the left side, all right, the deepest arch is going to be the most lateral. And that would be the transversalis fascia. And the lining of it would actually be the peritoneum. And then as we move more anteriorly, we move more medially. And you can see how this channel now is angled from lateral to medial. So if this was a left inguinal canal, this would be lateral and deep, and this would be superficial and medial. And so as we follow the external abdominal oblique, the fascia, remember the perimysium and epimysium of a muscle, continue on to form the tendon. And so the external abdominal oblique is anchored to the pelvic bones. But its fascia, its epimysium and perimysium, continues on down and wraps under and over to form the lateral wall, the roof, and the floor of this inguinal canal. Okay? And that would be that first anterior arch. Deep to that, remember the muscle between, we have the internal abdominal oblique. So not only its fascia, but actual skeletal muscle fibers of the internal oblique come down into and form part of the wrapping of the spermatic cord. So if we go back to this model diagram, this has all been cut open. Here's the opening of that canal. This would be the external spermatic fascia forming the outer covering. And here's the cremaster muscle, which is what we call the fibers of the internal abdominal oblique. So they are coming down. I'll diagram that with you in just a moment. They are coming down, forming a wrapping around the spermatic cord as well as covering the scrotum itself. Okay? The next layer is the internal abdominal oblique. Then we have transversalis fascia, and then we have the layer of peritoneum. All right, so each of these successively get pulled down into, then form the covering of the inguinal canal and the scrotum. And those I have listed for you, what they are and what they come from on page 50. Now, if we look at those similar structures form the spermatic wall cord, and now let's look at this diagram. Okay, we're going to look at those same layers. This is abdominal wall. This is spermatic cord covering, and this is scrotum. All right. So the black is going to be the skin. So scrotum, spermatic cord, and specifically the skin. The skin has epithelium, the epidermis, and the dermis. Within the subcutaneous tissue of the skin is a layer of smooth muscle. Because it's smooth muscle, it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it will respond to innervation as a reflex in response to temperature, and will contract and wrinkle the skin of the scrotum. So this red dotted line that I'm drawing is this yellow line here, which is the dartos muscle. And form this smooth muscle. Okay. Then the next layer, here's our external abdominal oblique, this thick band right here. And its fascia, not its muscle fibers, but its fascia will come down and form the external spermatic fascia. So this is the external abdominal oblique muscle. And the connective tissue around that will form a layer around the spermatic cord, a layer around the scrotum, and this is known as the external. It's nice that it matches our muscle, the external abdominal muscle, and this is external spermatic fascia. The next layer of our abdominal wall is the internal abdominal oblique. And that's the one that does send muscle fibers. Only these are skeletal muscles, not smooth muscle fibers. So this will be the internal abdominal oblique, but we changed the name of the muscle, and this is actually the cremaster muscle, and that's skeletal muscle. Okay. It also, when it contracts, will pull the testes closer to the body core and warm the testes up. There's a famous Seinfeld episode where George is at the Hampton, or wherever he is, up in New Jersey Shore or New York, and he's just come inside and he's explaining the change in appearance, that the water was really cold coming out of the ocean or the swimming pool or whatever, and that's a contraction of the cremaster muscle pulling the testes closer to the body. Okay? And it can be painful if they try to move up into the inguinal canal when there's not very much room in the inguinal canal. The internal abdominal oblique contributes some fascia, and then we have the transversalis fascia and internal spermatic fascia. You don't have to really worry about those. And then we have the peritoneum. How many of you remember the word peritoneum from Bio 430? All right, we have pleura, pericardium, those are membranes in the thoracic cavity, and peritoneum, which is a thin membrane that lines the abdominal cavity and covers abdominal organs. So remember